Thank you everybody for joining us today. It's a special occasion for our university. Regrettably, in these times of COVID, we had to make it as modest as possible, but still to keep to the main scenario of the honorary doctor's degree award. And for that reason, based on the incentive of Free University, Dr. Simon Jankov traveled specially for that reason to Georgia. So it's not that he was, somewhere in the neighborhood and dropped by. We should have been also, pleasure or honor for us, but it's more pleasure and more honor, higher honor, that this was like dedicated visit to our university. So to say few words, you all know Simon quite well. He was visiting our university. We know his friendship with Kaha Bendukidze. He has been a great, very useful, efficient, and great supporter of Free University, contributing to the development of ideas around the university, also assisting us in certain things to reach out to the broader global audience. You can detect Simon's fingerprints in the World Development Report. We are the possibly only university from the post-Soviet space. Free University is mentioned as a success case of building a new and efficient university. You all know that also the doing business methodology may bear some names as the authors, but mastermind behind this was Simеон, and we met each other through this publication, and I will tell you a small story about that. Simеон has been a colleague of mine, leading the new economic school in Moscow as a rector for a couple of years. Was a vice prime minister of Bulgaria. We cooperated by then on the government level as well. So we had the chance to work together, I think, in almost all, expressions of intellectual cooperation, whether in public sector or consultancy or private and so on. So the story is that when, with the leadership of Kaha Bendukidze, we started energetic reforms in 2004. There was no doing business on our mental map. So we are just doing what we believed it was right. And one day, I don't know how the communication was it 2005? That the World Bank contacted the government of Georgia, said, hey guys, by the way, you are doing great in doing business. Okay, we started to research around this topic and to find out that Georgia, without any intention to progress in the ranking, and due to Kaha's investment in intellectual investment in these reforms, we moved from 112th to 37th. And by then, Simеон visited Georgia as a World Bank representative, possibly to praise our job. Because there was a presentation in Marriott Hotel courtyard in the presence of the Biden Prime Minister Nogaydeli. And there was a small, I think, Q&A session after the presentation. And by then, we were 37th, as I said, and all of a sudden, without any consensus in the government, Nogaydeli said that, okay, but we will get into top 20. And I recall the, expression of Simon, skeptical expression of Simon that, okay, guys, so it was a great job, but calm down. But then Georgia got into top 20 and then got into top 10. And there was this long journey around this topic, but it's not only that. Simon is very active in economic research. He is highly citated economist, and I think in his speech, I had the pleasure to read the draft. So he will be touching these research issues also. So I think if the Free University is awarding intellectuals who are friends and collaborators of the university, I think with your agreement and your blessing, I think Simon is a really right person for that. And to demonstrate this, so firstly, here is your degree, or in 3 languages.
Thank you.
So I think it will find right place in your office, so somewhere. And so this is our traditional silver pin, which really, represents the logo of our university. So may I pin it?
Yes, please.
So it's nice even as a decoration. So yeah. And of course, in the old European tradition of the European universities, so here is a phone. So it's not part of the ceremony that the rectors serve the doctors, but in this case it should work. So.
COVID measures.
Yeah. So.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And so as a, doctor of our university also, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this honor. It's especially an honor for me to receive it from your university. As your president has mentioned, I actually have done quite a lot of work in Georgia over many years, research work as well as policy work as part of the World Bank. So I'll reflect a bit on this work and how far Georgia has gone in my speech. But I chose as a title of the speech actually a broader topic, which is changing national identity through institutional reform. So I want to talk about Georgia, but I want to also talk about how nations change and what are the lessons in economics research that we have learned over the last 30 or so years, not just from our region, from Eastern Europe, but globally. And then I would finish with some thoughts on COVID and how this crisis is actually challenging economists, but also politicians to think of the role of government and in general how much government participation or intervention, if you like, in the economy has been, but perhaps will be. So let me start first with some comments on Georgia and actually my relationship with Kaha Bendukidze and his reform team. I was actually working already in Georgia in the late 1990s as a very young, fresh out of graduate school. Had joined the World Bank and then was sent as one of the few people at the time who had Western economics knowledge and knowledge of Russian, was sent to a few countries, post-communist countries, to help with economic reform, economic restructuring. So I was first here in 1997, 1998, the then Shevardnadze governments, and basically saw firsthand how there was no change. So a lot of talks, a lot of discussion, but basically there was no progress. There was no desire for reform, but also there was no knowledge of what this reform would bring. So if you actually did reform, how the economy and how society change. So I had moved on to other countries and had not visited Georgia for a few years until early 2005, as was mentioned, when, as part of another World Bank team, I was asked to come back because a new government had come to Georgia after the Rose Revolution. And I was fairly skeptical, having my previous experience of spending actually months in Tbilisi without electricity much at the time, I remember, the fairly cold winters, and it was winter again, but I visited actually on my own, together with the local team. And then I distinctly remember this presentation that was just mentioned, and then seeing Kaha Bendukidze for the first time during the presentation. But mostly I remember the next day when I was invited to his office at a very, very early hour. I've worked in many, many countries for the World Bank over 20 years. But I have found that politicians and government ministers generally don't work very early hours and they don't work very late hours. But here in Georgia, I ended up working very early hours and very late hours with Kaha's team. But anyway, I remember waiting one very, very early morning, 6:30 or so, in the morning in the front room, the lobby of Kaha Bendukidze's office, which was the walls of the office had these cartoons, basically in many languages, of this very large man. I could not read all of them, but that was my first impression. And then I entered the room. I had not met Kaha before, and his first words were, "We cannot learn anything from the World Bank. The World Bank has nothing that we can learn from. Maybe you can learn from us." And that's why I invited you. You know, for somebody from the World Bank, this is not typically how you are how you're met anywhere. But I took it in stride, and then over the next few days, I met progressively a lot of the members of Kaha's team, including Vato, and we ended up meeting, as I mentioned. Usually, I would get a call like at 11 o'clock at night in the hotel and saying, "Are you awake?" What do I say? "Yes, now I'm awake." So in half an hour, let's meet in the lobby of the hotel and discuss reforms. And then we'll discuss reforms through the night. And we discuss specific reforms, like how to reform the company registry, how to reform customs at the time was a big topic. A number of very specific reforms that I was also knowledgeable about. And that's how over 3 or 4 years, my relationship with Georgia but also with the reformers team got developed. And many of the reforms that we can see now, not only in doing business, but in how Georgian society works today, are thanks to, I think, that period in time. I'll come back to some of them later in my talk. But before I move to broad areas, I want to mention one other period that perhaps is less known in my relationship with Georgia and specifically with this university, which is in the summer of 2008. I was invited and came to be a lecturer in the summer school of what then ended up being a tradition also of the university, to basically teach students free economics, free market economics, but also how society operates when markets are free. And this was the time, 2008, when Kahe and his team had started understanding, or maybe was already implementing after they had understood, the benefit of education and how much human capital accumulation through education matters for economic growth. So the Knowledge Fund was established the previous year, 2007. These summer schools were funded and sponsored by them. So over the years, a number of us, mostly from the United States, some from Europe, came and taught classes. Some of these students later came to the United States and had PhD programs success. Some of them are still my friends, and I'm talking to them regularly on research. But since that time, and linking it to the university, I actually got interested in human capital, on the research of human capital and how much it matters for economic growth. And in fact, in my lecture, which will be published later on this week, you would see some references of my latest work, which is on this very basic question: what matters for economic growth? So if you are a policymaker and you want to say, I want my country to grow faster, what are the factors that you should look at? And specifically, we have a study that 2 months ago came in the science journal Nature, which is one of the two top science journals in the world, that makes this called growth accounting calculation of how much human capital accumulation, education basically, matters for economic growth. And we find out that roughly 2/3, so a bit more than 60% of all economic growth over a long period of time, the last 40 years or so in the world, can be explained by human capital accumulation. It's a very important number because the traditional thinking in economics is that much more is explained by physical investment. So as long as a country saves a lot and invests in infrastructure, in visible things, bricks and mortars, that's really what matters. And then to have the latest machines and so on. Our research, which is based on a number of other more recent studies, says that basically 2/3 is what we learn here in this university, in this classroom, human capital, because it's through human capital that then you can use the better technologies. If you don't have the knowledge, you can never appropriate and actually create the next wave of technology. So human capital, in other words, has become part of my research focus and will continue to be a major part in the future. But going back to the topic of national identity and institutional change, there is a long literature going back to Max Weber 120 years ago, when at the time there was mostly research in sociology basically saying nations, or if you like, cultures, are so different that either based on religion or based on the culture that perhaps created by religion or established by religion or formed by religion, you can pretty much see historically which countries and which nations can develop well economically. And the contribution of Max Weber, which is 1904, 1905, so a long time ago, was basically to say, you know, some cultures, some religions predispose the development of efficient markets because they allow essentially individuals to operate freely in business. And some religions, some cultures are better than others, or at least more set up than others in doing that. So in his case, the Protestant countries or nations of some of Western Europe. So he made that point, which for a number of decades was quite hotly debated. And then Douglas North came about 8 years after that and then linked it to economic growth, to these long-term economic growth studies, to basically say, yes, there are very big differences historically on how nations economically develop, and you can trace this to the way that society is organized, and also how people think of themselves and how they link to others, hence the topic of national identity. Because before that, there were a number of examples saying, well, maybe that's true, but how do you actually get that culture? Because if you're telling us that it's religion and then culture, it takes centuries for it to develop. So how do you create the institutions? Is it possible in a short period of time to break through, if you like? And then in the 1990s, when Eastern Europe opened up after decades of socialism or communism, suddenly this topic became live again of can you start from scratch in a way, because socialism destroyed many of the previous institutions of free markets or societal institutions. Can you start from scratch and create something along the lines of what Max Weber was talking about, and then later Douglas North? I'm saying all of this history of economic thought to come to the Georgian experience, but also some other experiences in transition in Estonia, in Latvia, Lithuania, in the Czech Republic, in some other countries in our region, where policymakers, but also researchers basically had this decision to make. Do we start and create the new institutions for both democracy and free markets, or do we sort of try to adjust what we have? And the Rose Revolution period in Georgia, to me, was characterized by we're trying at the margin to tinker and see how far we can go with existing institutions, and that didn't go anywhere. Or the experience from 2004 on, we are basically breaking from the past and we're going to create new institutions. And in some cases, this is truly means, and I remember, and in the lecture mentioned, one of the first impressions that you get, of course, from a country is just the rules of visiting the country. Do you need a very complicated visa process? At the time, it was extremely difficult to come to Georgia 15 years ago. What exactly was so specific that Georgians were afraid of people like me coming, or the government rather, but it was very difficult to get a visa. Even if you're part of the World Bank, you had to prove where you come from and who your family is and where your parents are, and so on, things that like the normal person wouldn't necessarily know. But I remember this very complicated entry procedure. And overnight, sometime in 2005, this was lifted. So I remember going through the still old part of the airport, and nobody's asking me anything. So you quietly walk, look, should somebody ask you anything? No, so just pass through. But that opening, basically not requiring visas from the vast majority of people in the world, or just getting the visa when you land. Now we think it's a small thing. At the time, it was a major deterrent to free movement of people, to business, to tourism, not just in Georgia, but in the whole region. And even now, if you see some of your neighbors and try to visit them, it's still the same process. So haven't quite gotten to the point of how important it is for people, both their own nationals as well as foreigners, to visit. But there are many other reforms that happened in that period. I remember, for example, the reform of the road police. So it used to be that when you come here, even if you are part of a large institution like the World Bank, you would hire a driver who is basically a policeman or retired policeman, so that you don't get stopped every kilometer on the street and basically ask for a bribe. So basically, I would have a driver who has a police uniform, and he wouldn't be stopped on the road. You know the history of this reform, which, by the way, at the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, where I work, a few years ago, we put together a book where Kaha Bendukidze and Mikhail Saakashvili have a beautiful chapter saying the most ambitious reforms that explain some of these reform processes, not only what happened, but the thinking process of can you actually disband the whole police force for a period of time and start from scratch. In most countries in the world, you couldn't. Like, just the idea that a government would do that was unthinkable. In Georgia at the time, that was done in customs, that was done in the police, and probably in some other areas. But as I mentioned from my research, the area that ends up being most important over time actually is the educational system. University education, tertiary education certainly, but also the secondary education field. And many reforms were done during that process then. To say, going back 30 years, that when the transition economists started finding answers or looking for answers, a lot of the focus was on two topics. Should we privatize, and how quickly? And how to establish macroeconomic stability. So if you look at the research areas 25, 30 years ago, nearly everything was going in these two areas. Turns out the answer on privatization, fast or slow, didn't matter that much. Both countries that reform fast, like let's say the Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia at the time, or slow, as is the case of Hungary and to some extent Poland, quickly converged. So it didn't matter whether you reform or whether you privatize outright or in a few years. Macroeconomic stability, some countries meandered, but by and large, we know now in retrospect that there was a formula, and in a few years, if you followed this formula, you would have gotten there. So these were not really the most important reforms. The most important reforms, as I mentioned, were these deep institutional reforms of how you change the educational system, how you change some of the institutions for public policy, so that over time you can bring economic growth. Georgia at the time did it. Many countries didn't in our region, but particularly in the post-Soviet Union space, which is why you still see some cases of some countries grow, then growth disappears. Growth disappears. Or some other countries like Tajikistan, like Moldova, that actually have not grown at all. They have gotten poorer over the last 30 years. Ukraine is another country like that. I want to finish with two thoughts or areas of research. One that I mentioned, which is COVID, but the other one, which is more specific to our region, initially, and now we see it around the world, is that there is a period of rapid reform, institutional change. We can say that Georgia went through this period, and some of you were part of this reform effort. But as we know from history, neither economic policy nor societal change is monotone, so it's not a straight line. So there have been cases in our region where you are considered a top reformer and then you start backsliding. So Hungary, for a period of time, has been like this in Central Europe, in my region. In more recent time, in some at least policies, Georgia is actually considered to be backsliding from some of the reforms that were done in the past. I mentioned free travel, since I was coming last night, this morning from Europe. It's actually much more difficult to come to Georgia now, to Tbilisi through the airport, than it was to go to Germany, which I just passed through France, because there is a form that you need to fill. It has a good public reason, which is a COVID form, but with one problem. It's only available in Georgian. So even if you try to get it in English or something else, it doesn't work, at least. So when I was passing through Istanbul airport yesterday, there was a very long line of people who are not Georgian and could not read it, and we had to ask a Georgian person, "Can you tell me what this is? Can you tell me what this is?" And so on. Did not exist in Germany. You know, they're as concerned with public health as you are. Did not exist in France, which is typically considered one of the most bureaucratic and administrative countries. But, you know, Georgia decided that it's good to put in Georgian a fairly complicated package to make sure that those of us who, by the way, have vaccines and have gone through this process in a number of other countries are not endangering you. I'm happy. Yes, and I had a crash course. The issue with that crash course is that there are 40 people behind me on the line, but we did succeed in.
Suddenly discovered that not all passengers of Turkish Airlines speak Georgian.
Yet,
What's the
yet.
surprise?
But I'll be telling everybody now, you better learn Georgian before you visit this beautiful country. But let me finish with one paragraph on COVID and COVID economics, because it does relate to the general topic of reforms and what's the role of government. Because ultimately the reforms that we're discussing, one way to look at them is what's the scope of government? What should governments do? Should they care about public health? They certainly should care about public health. So they should make sure that people who visit are not danger to Georgian society. Should they organize a fairly complicated, only in Georgian online form? Probably not. Probably there are easier ways to do this so that they don't endanger free travel. But COVID actually more generally does create this issue, because during COVID, governments, particularly in advanced economies, are spending a record amount of money. Just to give you an idea, the United States last year, 2020, the budget was in a budget deficit of 19%. Most countries would go bankrupt if they have in a year 19% budget deficit. This year, the US budget deficit is projected at 16%. So in 2 years, basically, the US is spending 35% more than it is making, and many of the advanced economies are like that. Very, very large budget deficits, which means that the government is spending a lot of money, both socially but also in the help of business, hopefully in good ways. But in doing so, it's actually getting into areas that traditionally, at least for a period of time, they were not part of. And also, by the way, in many countries, taking over certain companies that are insolvent or at least cannot deal with the effects of the crisis, getting in many more regulations of public health, of how you do educational or healthcare services, and so on. And we know from history that that's going to stay with us for some time. So when COVID disappears, or at least when we're all vaccinated, some of these regulations are going to stay with us for a period of time. And they will be, again, Max Weber was writing about this, and Douglas North were writing in their studies, there will be a period where society itself would say, well, we need more government. The right way to build society is with more government regulation. And I'll finish with that thought, which is consistent with where I started the reforms in Georgia. The work that Kaha Bendukidze and his team did here is that it may be that society at times needs more government, but we also know through history that the governments or the countries and nations where governments have been prevalent and are involved in many aspects of especially economic life do not grow fast, because governments typically do not know necessarily what's best for the individual business, for the individual household. It is much better to operate in a free market and create the types of regulations and the types of institutions which at least the compliance costs, the administrative barriers for business and for households are as small as possible. Technology helps in that regard, because as we've seen through online education, now we can do things that literally 10 years or so ago were nearly impossible to do. So technology does reduce significantly the costs of providing services, all kinds of services. And we hope that in the next few years, what would remain with us from COVID would not be more regulations necessarily, but a cheaper, easier, faster way to work for businesses and to work for households. I would stop here. I'm honored very much again to be here with you. I also realize that this is one of the few public lectures that you've probably had. This is my first travel in the last year also. So I wasn't even sure whether I'll manage to make it here. So very happy to be here with you, and thank you very much for the honor. Thank you.
Maybe we will have short Q&A sessions if there are questions.
Please.
Yeah. So you were mentioning about Max Weber, and we were also reading most well known of his why capitalism was successful in the Protestant countries, nations. But then we were also thinking about what happened with the Orthodox world. Even with our friend Krasen, we made a conference in Sofia once about this. But this is a very wide, really very wide thing, because there are many different nations in the Orthodox world. But they are seemingly like they are similar, you can say. But
Yeah.
they are not. But anyway, we had such questions.
Protestants are also similar.
Yeah, but we had such questions like what the Orthodox Church or Orthodox people think about free market, free trade, government, and such kind of things. So you can read many things of the scholastics of Spanish or Netherlands or some other thinkers, but there is no such a thing. We don't know. Maybe some Georgian priests also in 500 years ago, so they had their own ideas about this, but we don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
So here, I think there is a small thing that maybe we are missing some information.
Yeah.
Maybe I will comment before you answer. So our contribution to this question was that one of our PhD students took this topic as a research. So of course, it's huge deficit in this, but he really studied not only Georgian exam, but the Orthodox world. So what was this attitude? So it's difficult subject, but I think we made at least very small but significant contribution to that. So just to comment on it. You can read the PhD, maybe there could be some answers.
I think the COVID situation is opening this whole topic of institutions, which was a big topic in the 80s, as I mentioned, became with new data a topic about 20 years ago, which is actually my own contributions to business regulation and the study of growth started happening. Daron Osemoglu and Robinson had this book, Why Nations Failed, based on their research at the time. And then lately, institutions have not been so much the topic of study, at least in large universities, because economics became much more micro, trying to understand not necessarily how large policies work, but if you're having a very specific policy, let's say in education, how to fine-tune it so that you get the most points, so to speak, out of it. And now with COVID, the topic of how much government and what scope of government is coming back. So the questions that you're asking, I predict will come back. And in that regard, actually, that's why I said that Georgia, not just because of the success of the reforms, but if one were to just read Max Weber and Douglas North and so on, Georgia wouldn't have been a reformer. Because, as you said, it's an Orthodox country. It was for a long time in the Russian/Soviet empire. So unlike Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, who fit very neatly Max Weber's model of Protestants, Lutherans, and so on, nobody would have expected Georgia. Which then gets to your point. So there is a gap. We don't understand something how it happens, both across Orthodox countries, but even how can you push a nation in this case in a direction that suddenly is different. The identity has changed. And in that regard, in economics, actually, there are very useful studies that basically look at migrants and say, so there's a famous study in the early 90s that says Haiti is not one of the countries known for economic growth or anything pretty much. But if you follow anything good, yes. But if you follow Haitian immigrants to the US, first and second generation, you see that just in the course of about 5 years, the first generation Haitians start behaving basically like Americans in the sense of productivity in economic terms. And then by the second generation, their kids are actually much more productive than the average American because they have both the push of being migrants, plus they have adopted, if you like, the practices of the US. So somehow your previous culture, and they haven't changed their religion, so religion hasn't changed, culture has not changed in significant way in that short period, but somehow in 5 years you behave very differently once you're in a different set of institutions. This study has been replicated with a number of other countries, French people, German people going to the US or to Australia and so on, and you find this phenomenon that the moment you take people to a different set of institutions, they actually behave differently, which in some sense goes to...
Koreans could be a good example. Koreans would be
Yes, no, it can be. Well, I think their language starts being being an issue, a bit like my Georgian example. But yes, you can. So it must be that we are missing a piece, not just across, let's say, Orthodox or across Protestants, but also what is it that you can take a country that just based on history you don't think would be able to grow much faster than before, and you make it. So what's the push that happens? And that we don't know enough. I think in that regard, that's why I ended my lecture with technology and with COVID, because COVID has provided many negative things, of course. For a year we couldn't travel, we couldn't see other people and so on. But it has also pushed us to do things through new technology that we wouldn't have done before, at least not so fast. And maybe that's a way where you can catch up. So countries that, like ours, actually, like in Eastern Europe, that technologically we actually were reasonably good in communications before, suddenly we can do a lot better than some of the other countries, but it's a big unknown. Other thoughts or questions?
There is a professor at Bonn University, Professor Wede, who is studying such kind of issues. What are the differences of development of different countries by historical facts, and from China to the US, all countries that he never studied Orthodox countries.
So we need to study them, that's right. So I have actually a couple of studies on this, on happiness. Actually, I forgot to mention this in my lecture. So there's a very interesting set of sociological studies, and I, in the last few years, I've contributed with 2 such studies that basically asks why are people happy or unhappy on economic grounds? You know, because there is this general thing of if you're richer, you should be happier because at least, you know, you don't have to worry about tomorrow and the day after tomorrow and so on. So, which happens not to be true. So it is true that up to a point, income helps you, and then it actually starts hurting you. So it's the so-called U-curve or inverse U-curve. So if you look across countries and over all income groups, actually income is not associated with happiness globally. But the part that I was mostly interested in, to get to the Orthodox, of all religions in the world, according to basic sociological polling, the Orthodox people are at least they say that they're the least happy people in the world. And then among these people, they're the Ukrainians, who are the absolute world record holders of unhappiness. So they're so unhappy that like 3% of, in the latest study that I was using from 2018, only 3% of Ukrainians said that they're happy, 97% are unhappy. And it's not income-based, so you can compare Ukraine to other countries at the same income level, and if you go, let's say, to Latin American countries, you know, 70% are happy. So Ukraine is a real outlier. And then the other outliers, notice, Serbia, Bulgaria, Armenia. Georgians, for some reason, are happier than the other Orthodox people, than Armenians, certainly, but Bulgaria, Serbia, really unhappy people. And you try to find out why, because it's not income, it's not weather, because one of the other main predictors of happiness is actually the number of sunshine days. So if you live in a country that doesn't have sunshine, you're not happy. But if you remove all of these things, there is a big kind of remaining component of explaining happiness in Orthodoxy, which remains, it's a question mark. Whether that's religion, I doubt it, because it's been so long that some of these countries have not been religious, like Bulgaria. But you're right, maybe more PhD and master's thesis should go in that direction.
Kazakhs are very happy, much happier than Georgians.
Who is?
Kazakhs.
Kazakhs.
Kazakhs are much happier than Georgians, but strangely they are traveling to Georgia, but Georgians never travel to Kazakhstan.
Yeah, so lots to explain.
Yeah, traveling makes them happy.
Exactly, so that's why they are happy.
So one of the scenarios of the post-COVID global economy development is that the rich countries will get richer because they, as you mentioned, they can afford
massive fiscal packages.
Things that may be extraordinary from a common sense point of view, which may backlash sometime in 10 years or something like that with another subprime, the mortgage crisis or whatever. But just right after the post-COVID period, they may get out richer.
Yep.
And on the other hand, there are transition economies or poorer countries which may get poorer. And this, of course, is measured mostly as personal income levels. It's a difference. So it's not that nominally they may not get richer, but as the gap widens, the perception that the rich are richer is more. So do you support this scenario? So I'm really thinking about also critically, because this may not be also true, but
no, I think
there is some real, how to say, not evidence, but logic behind this scenario also.
so. I think,
or will it be more equalized because the rich cannot get really richer after the crisis?
So I think there are two. So I think this is happening, and it will become much more apparent at the end of this year, or early next year, when the results for the economic growth statistics for this year come, and also 2022, when we have a full post-crisis or post-COVID rather year, when advanced economies relative to their trend would grow much faster, and emerging economies would grow still, my prediction, below their trend. And I think there are two reasons for that. You mentioned one of them. The first reason is that advanced economies can afford and are spending much more money than emerging markets either can afford or are prepared to. So you could argue that given the current interest rates in the world, even some emerging markets can have large budget deficits. But the tradition is not there precisely because of this memory. We blow the budget for a couple of years and then we have a big decline. So just policy is not even created that way in most countries because of currency boards, other arrangements. While I mentioned in the US, it's not even a discussion whether a 16% budget deficit is a good or bad thing this year. It's just this is how it is. So the discussion is how long can this last? Is it 2023 or 2024? This is the discussion. So next year is also going to be a similar, very large fiscal budget. And this money goes directly to households, but a lot of it goes to the business sector. Small firms especially, but also a number of large firms. And it's both loans, but also grants to small firms. The same is true for the UK. Now France and Germany are catching up. They're a bit slow, but now France and Germany have a budget deficit about 12-13% this year. Very large budget deficits, given that Germany has basically run a flat budget for a number of years. Where do this money go? Well, they go to their businesses. So their businesses actually are coming out of the crisis in a way much stronger than they were entering, because they have access to financing that they didn't have before. But the second dynamic, which is helping this trend, is that the emerging markets world is still closed. So for a year it was closed. So global value chain started breaking up. So you tried around the world to produce as much as possible within your country, or at least to a close country, because you didn't know how long COVID would last. And now Africa, Latin America, Asia are still in the midst of COVID, so that's going to be for some time. So if I am, let's say, a German firm or a US firm, I have a lot of money, I have demand. I'm now starting to put much of the value chain before me in the US or in Germany or maybe in the Czech Republic, but not in localize it, because I can depend on it. And once that happens, notice what's happening. So growth is rising in my country, I'm pulling up, and then I'm actually bringing the value chain close to me. So that's giving a secondary effect of pulling up and away from emerging markets. So in 2 years, when emerging markets hopefully are free of COVID and all vaccinated and so on, a lot of what they depended on, especially in terms of manufacturing, is not there because it's being pulled up. So I actually expect divergence to be very significant a bit this year, but next year and the year after. And that actually poses a big challenge, because if you read the last 20 years of how developing countries grow, basically global value chains particularly in manufacturing, a bit in services. Manufacturing has completely broken, so you see it being localized. But now, even in services, now that we have these virtual abilities in much of the advanced world, it's actually become cheaper. So the costs of producing things in developed advanced economies actually have fallen. So divergence is going to be happening, is already happening, and I think it creates a lot of issues for countries that had this economic growth narrative of we're catching up because Germany is pulling us up. Well, Germany is not going to pull you anymore, at least not as much.
Okay, and maybe not directly related. One more question is that it's possibly speculation, not the scientific part of it. What do you expect? How long this cheap money will be available? Because it may, as you suggested, that when governments recognize, for instance, Georgia issued the 5-year bonds with a coupon of 2.7% or something.
Yeah.
Nothing. We worked very hard. Georgia was, star. And our coupon by then was 7.5 or something. To get it below 7 was, tremendous job. Now this, government which doesn't think that, which thinks that foreigners also read. Georgia could issue the bonds much better, much better terms. And when they discover that this, or not only Georgia government, but many
everybody,
other governments, okay, it's easy money. You can spend it, and so do you expect something like Dutch disease or something that may infect after COVID these countries? Because of
so this is currently the biggest discussion, at least in the United States, is when inflation is coming, like a big flow of a big rise in inflation. So everybody agrees that significant inflation is coming, but even reasonable economists disagree when. Because it gets to the point first of how long they're going to be cheap money. So in the US, that answer seems to be to have a policy answer, which is that the Federal Reserve will keep cheap money until the end of 2023. So basically for another 2 years in the US, large amounts of money would be put in the markets. And because the US dominates the financial markets, that gives you a good idea for the rest of the world. At least for 2 years, there will be a flow of cheap money. The ECB, the European Central Bank, always follows or is delayed, let's say, maybe not follows the US, which means that if the US sets the target until the end 2023, that means Europe, the European Central Bank, sometime in 2024. So we have 2.5 years at least of cheap money in both the US and the EU. But that cheap money, while yes, you say that Georgia is from 7 has fallen to 2.7. In the US currently it's negative yield. Yeah. So you truly are borrowing, and there is no interest costs to government, and relatively close to zero for large corporates as well. So it will create large inflationary pressures, and this is where economists disagree. So some economists, and at the Peterson Institute we have this discussion since we have Larry Summers on the one side saying inflation is coming next year and it's really going to wipe out some of the poorer households, and we have Olivier Blanchard, who is one of the top macroeconomists, a French person, saying it's coming but in 2 or 3 years, so there is some delay. And this is based on this discussion, is based on, is there technology improvement in the meantime? Goes to this question of, has COVID actually learned or taught us something that we can do more efficiently? And we see it in education, in online training, that suddenly you switched, you had to do this. In some cases, it's not exactly the same as being in the classroom versus online, but it also has a lot of costs being reduced, not just of the actual teaching, but also people traveling back and forth. Time cost is significantly reduced. So in different sectors of the economy, does COVID basically bring new technology or new innovations that have increased productivity? And if so, that productivity offsets inflation. And this is the discussion that we currently have, but it's too early. I think with this money, we would see a general macroeconomic growth, much more significant than we've seen even pre-COVID in countries like the US is 7.5% growth this year. They have not grown like that since the Second World War, basically. So it's much higher than was even anticipated.
China grew in the first quarter 18%.
Yeah.
18.
The question then is it across all sectors, or is it that now we will see everybody being optimistic, even the orthodox people, and then suddenly next year we realize, yeah, but these sectors are not going to survive. Like tourism is never going to be the same, because by now this mass tourism, for example, they're not going to come back in this way. And if so, they need to shift somewhere. And in countries that depend on mass tourism or mass transport or some other areas that are this type of social interaction is high, then we need a different way to run the economy. But that's a topic for next year, perhaps, if I visit then.
Question?
Thank you. I think
Thank you.
thank you very much, and again.